Greetings, friends! Juan Ingruski here, and this is the weekly Russian-Ukrainian War Update for the week of November 17th through November 23rd of 2025. If you want to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War Updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up, and comment your thoughts. And I hope you guys are having a wonderful day today, because we are going to now begin our discussion of what happened in the last week in the war in Ukraine in the Huliaipole, Dnipropetrovsk direction. This is kind of like the big to do now. This is where the big action's happening, because this is where a lot of gains are happening, and a lot of people are now just starting to focus on it. But because it's not some big sexy battle like Pokrovsk or Kupyansk, that no one has really paid attention to this until recently, because the Russians are now about to start the battle for Huliaipole very soon, and the Russians are continuously doing efforts to start encircling it, basically putting it into a semi-encirclement like they do with other big towns and cities, so they could force the Ukrainians out. And let's talk about what those actions were. So one of the biggest things is that the Russians have completely captured the villages of Vasola, Zelona High. Some Russian sources are saying they also completely took the village of Veshchasok. This mapper says it's like split, that it's like not completely captured yet. We have geolocate confirmation of the Russians raising their flags in Vasola. We also had last week, as we remember, the Russians, moving through this road here and entering this area right here, right on the outskirts of this village of Zaporizhia here. We don't have any geolocate confirmation. We had geolocate confirmation of the Russians raising their flags in Vasola, and I think in Zelona High, but not in Veshchasok. So, but in any case, a lot of mappers are saying that it's right now getting clear. They just need to clear this area before they can start raising their flags here. But regardless, these set of villages that protected the eastern flank of Huliaipole have collapsed and have been conquered by the Russians, or probably are about to be conquered within a day. This is a very bad news for the Ukrainians, because this held the Russians back at bay from Huliaipole. Now, if you look at the fortification map, the way Huliaipole is defended is that there's a bunch of trench networks that kind of go up like this. This is like this red line kind of represents the main trench networks that protect Huliaipole. However, as you can see, with the main Russian attack is coming from the north here. They're going to basically bypass or attack these fortifications from behind. This is why these villages fell very rapidly, even though they actually were a critical component of the defenses of Huliaipole, because they got attacked from the north and such. We see that right now the Russians are slowly encroaching onto Huliaipole, and right now battles are going on for villages at Zaporizhia here. It's not really, as again, it's one of these small villages. It's like has one or two roads, has some warehouses. We had no confirmation of the Russians captured this village, but I'm betting you that the Russians are operating here, and the Ukrainians have fallen back to Huliaipole itself to hide from drones. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians capture this village, and maybe by the end of November they actually start battling. As I mentioned, that the city of Huliaipole is split in half by a river here in this red line, and so there's this northern part of Huliaipole that the Russians will probably try to storm and take, and then this is where they'll accumulate forces to then start the offensive into the center of the main part of Huliaipole itself. So that's what's happening there. The Russians are right now very much, they're not in Huliaipole yet, but the battle for Huliaipole is about to start. They're just right now doing shaping operations. Same thing's happening in the more northern part here to start cutting off logistics. We talked about how the Russians completely captured the village of Dnipropetrovsk last week, and this week they did not stop. This week we had the Russians capture the villages of Nakarika here, Radishny, and then they also said they captured Novoselivka, but we didn't have any actual flag raising operations happening in Novoselivka. But it does make sense. We had flag raising operations in Radishny here, and this is basically just a continuation of Radishny here. It's like there's no different. It's basically the same village. So if the Russians capture Radishny, it's a good bet that they probably also have captured Novoselivka. The Russians claim they have, so I think it's a good, it's not out of the question or out of the ordinary that they have captured it. So, again, the Russians are pushing through, reaching the river here. The next Ukrainian defense line is actually on the other side of, I think this is called the Hanacha River. Yeah, the Hanacha River. This is the river that actually splits Huliaipole into two parts. Now, there's the last kind of big defense line the Ukrainians have are on the other side of this river, centered around the towns of Myrnohrad, Vozojiriska, and kind of like right here. It's kind of like fortified around here, and so I thought the Russians would try to do some sort of breakthrough because right now the Ukrainian forces here are in disrepair, and they would probably try to cross the river, maybe try to take Novatka, have a very solid bridgehead. Because if this line of defenses fall, there's basically no other defenses until Zaporizhia. So it's gonna be, if the Russians do some breakthrough here, it'd be very bad news. But what I've heard is that the Ukrainians are finally realizing how in danger they are here and are actually sending reinforcements here. So it does seem like they might stabilize the front around these set of towns on the other side of this river here, and the Russians will probably focus on taking Huliaipole, and then we'll see. We might see a slowdown here. That once the Russians take everything on the other side of this river, take these last few villages here and start attacking Huliaipole from the northwest here, from the east, and then just from the north in general, and then just take Huliaipole. Then they could use Huliaipole to maybe undercut it, maybe attack from this direction. However, there's also a bunch of trenches in this direction here too. So, we might see this area. If the Ukrainians send enough troops, we could see a part where we see a slowdown as they're able to start holding on to these positions, and the Russians take everything up to here. And then, so there'll be a river that protects the Russians, but it also protects the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have some built-up positions here. The Russians will have taken Huliaipole, which will be a good starting point for future operations. But this is where I think will happen during the winter time. We could probably see this by the end of this year, by once 2026 comes around, and this is where the front line will kind of be. But, if the Russians do make a breakthrough here right now and make a bridge here, then all bets are off. We could see start a huge blooming flower, across Zaporizhia. But it just depends on the status of Ukrainian forces here. A bit more to the north here in the Dnipropetrovsk area is that we had 100% confirmation. The Russians have raised their flags in the village of Tika. This is on the other side. Again, this is another river, the Voshka River, which splits this area in half. The Russians took Tika. They also took the village of Guy. They also claim they have taken the village of Vidrania here, this village right here. However, we did not actually. Sometimes it's weird. The group of forces east is usually pretty reliable. They show them attacking the village, how they were bombing it, and then how they entered it and raised their flags here. But this is where they were just showing us them bombing this area, and then they never actually showed us them raising their flags here. It's not out of the question that they took Vidrania, obviously, but because obviously, as you can see, the Russians have been pushing in these directions. It's not out of the question, as the Russians pushed here in Dnipropetrovsk in this area here, that they took Vidrania as well. But it's just a bit of a question mark. Maybe they need to consolidate a bit more. But we do have 100% confirmation of the Russians raising their flags on Tika. So this is a very, the Russians are just taking everything up against this river. Right now, probably also a lot of pro-Ukrainian sources says that they pushed the Russians out of Dnipropetrovsk. One thing to mention is that I could buy that the Russians maybe push the Ukrainians out of here, but then they don't stay here. Obviously these villages aren't really the biggest villages in the world, and it's probably maybe the Russians enter here, but then maybe they don't stay. Maybe they retreat back to more solidified defenses in Vishana and Uspenivka and such. But just to claim that this is now under Ukrainian controls, if the Russians can't hold on to it, then the Ukrainians definitely cannot. So we didn't have any geolocated confirmation of the Ukrainians being in Dnipropetrovsk. So the Ukrainian claim that they pushed the Russians out of Dnipropetrovsk, I think, is false, especially considering we have the Russians raising their flags at least in these two villages down here. But so I'm assuming Dnipropetrovsk is still under Russian control, but we just need more data coming in. But if it is, then obviously the main goal here is that the Russians want to also reach this river, the Hernachka River that goes up here, take Andriivka, and then probably the biggest goal was to take the village of Alexandriivka here, which will, again, like our Stepopol, is the forward operating base where the Russians will use to attack Pokrovsk here. So Pokrovsk and Lyman are the defense line for the Ukrainians here, and the Russians need to take these two villages to secure their northern flank here, and it'll be a very good stepping off point for further advances into the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. But right now, the Russians are just taking everything that is underneath this this river here. As you can see, they already did that in the eastern part, so everything behind this red line here is what I think the Russians will focus on. Probably check Andriivka, Osipasiski here, and probably start trying to drive towards Alexandriivka here. So, that might be what the Russians focus on. Maybe if the Russians, hit a brick wall in the Zaporizhia direction after the fall of Huliaipole, maybe they focus northwards and try to start storming Pokrovsk and Vlyman and such. But yeah, and yeah, that's basically the Huliaipole Dnipropetrovsk direction, a lot of big things are happening here. I wouldn't be and such. In the Zaporizhia direction, there's been no changes in the Stepanhersk area. The biggest change, however, has been we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians doing some sort of big attack and entering the village of Novoselivka here and disembarking in the southern part of the village here. We don't know if that got destroyed and then they got kicked out. Kind of same thing with Myrnohrad. They claim they took it, but we have not gotten any more videos of it. I think we had a video maybe a week or two ago, the Russians being bombed in the eastern part. The biggest proof that if that the Russians should do is probably raise their flag in this kind of prison colony, which is the main stronghold in Myrnohrad here. So, if they have taken Myrnohrad and if they're able to consolidate Novoselivka and capture it, then this would give them a very strong forward operating position towards Orekov. But again, Orekov knows that this has been a frontline town for 4 years now, and so there's very much strong defenses here. And so, even if the Russians take Myrnohrad and Novoselivka, the Ukrainians are ready to, a frontal attack will be very costly. But, maybe this is what's going to happen. Maybe they just, we shall see. Anyway, so that's what's happening in the Huliaipole, Dnipropetrovsk, Zaporizhia directions. Now, you might be thinking, we're going to go to the Pokrovsk direction next, right? Well, actually, we're actually going to be going to where, you probably saw this from the title of the video, the Seversk direction, because the battle for Seversk has started. Yes, this was a big, I thought, maybe this was, it wasn't like, we saw this coming, but this kind of came out in a big spectacular fashion, is that the battle for Seversk has started. We actually had 3 different geolocations of the Russians being in the southern part of Seversk. Now, this makes sense. The southern part of Seversk is mostly this residential area, so the actual geolocations is, for the first one we had was in the southern part here, which made sense. I'm like, okay, we had the Russians slowly but surely creeping up towards here. It makes sense the Russians are in the southern part of Seversk. But then the biggest geolocation news was that we had Russians being in this area. So this does prove that the Russians are actually in a more deeper position in Seversk than originally thought. Now, as you can see, there is the Seversk Citadel, which has all these high-rise buildings, and the Seversk rail station, which I think has been blown up into smithereens. Even this map, which, is not daily updated. This is like a year old or so. Even, this old map shows that this entire railway station got obliterated into smithereens. So, just imagine what's been happening for the last year. This is where the main defenses of the Ukrainians are for Seversk. If the Ukrainians lose the train station or this fortified citadel, then Seversk is lost. The only thing left would be this area on the other side of the Bakhmutka River, and the only saving grace of that is because there's a river, there's like these like kind of more places on a more higher elevation on the other side here where the Ukrainians could attack the Russians on the lower ground. The thing is that the Russians are actually now pressuring, after they captured Myrnohrad, we actually had the Russians completely capture the village of Platovka as well. We actually had geolocated confirmation of this. And from this, I have no doubts that the Russians will then use these 2 villages to continue pushing southward. Some sources are saying they already, moved here, captured these fields, and cut this highway. They're probably going to continue pushing towards the village of Zaporizhia here because it kind of links up with what's happening in the Lyman direction. But, the Russians are just going to keep move southwards here, probably try to capture these fields to the north here, and then once they do that, then they could actually continue pushing southwards and take this stronghold here, and then this would spell the end of Seversk, even the most western part of it. So the Russians have entered it. Now the thing is that Ukrainian sources are saying, okay, they entered it, but these are DRGs, they got eliminated, there's no consolidation. That could be true, that could be possible, but it just depends on, we just need more, we need to see what happens. This was happened a little bit earlier in the week, and we haven't got any more updates since then, but right now most sources are saying that the southern part of Seversk has been captured by Russian forces. Now we'll just have to see if the Russians consolidated here. Alrighty, and then also in the southern part, the biggest thing is that this helps the Russians a lot. So the Russians have completely captured the village of Zvonovka. We have the Russians raising their flags in the northern part of this town, so this proves it is under control. So yeah, that's very good. Zvonovka is a very decent-sized town. Same thing with Prozhizhnya here. These are, now these towns have been blown up to smithereens as well, but there is still like some places like basements the Russians could accumulate forces here, and then from here, this is where they could then enter Seversk from this area. So because if you look from the more eastern side, there's no real like there's no like actual town here. There's no way the Russians can enter Seversk. They have to go all the way back to Velika Myrnohrad here, this giant oil processing center. So it's very hard for the Russians to consolidate. They have to walk through open fields, and that puts them in danger of drones. Same thing in the southern part here. So Zwanivka is a very good kind of touching off point where there's actually a big enough town where the Russians can accumulate forces to enter Seversk, and so forth. And the battle for Seversk has started, and the Ukrainian defenses here has already cracked. So we shall see if the Russians could continue their offensive here. And then also another thing in the Seversk direction is that the Russians, according to the Russian MOD, is that they completely captured the village of Pazanio here, which would be a big deal. However, we had no geolocate confirmation of this, so this is a big question mark. Even this mapper is not updated for it. If this has been taken, this would be a very bad news for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians were holding, so there's like this Bakhmutka River here. And the Ukrainians have been using these fields that are to the west of it, which are on a higher elevation, to basically attack any Russian troops that try to enter. But the Russians are already here and are now capturing more of these strongholds. Then there's a lot of let's say they captured this area here. Then this would be very bad news, because then the Russians have a forward operating position and they're actually on even elevation. So we shall. But we don't have any proof of that. But that's just something that they claim they have taken. But we have to put a question mark on that. And then also this mapper said that Novoselivka has been taken, but this village has been going back and forth all the time. So we shall. The reason why the Russians have never been able to consolidate in Novoselivka because it's on the other side of this river, and there's like a bunch of these fortifications to the north of it where they could drive the Russians out of the low ground here. So, but if the Russians aren't in control of Pazanio, then they can actually secure themselves in Novoselivka here. So, but we need more proof of what's happening there. And then now we're going to go to the Lyman direction, kind of connects with the Seversk direction a little bit, but the Lyman direction is actually where a lot of big things happen. And the last few weeks or so, there's actually been a bit of a pause in Lyman direction during the fall, after the beginning. Right now we're about to enter the winter campaign, and for the after September ended, there was a bit of a pause in the Lyman direction. Now that didn't mean there was no battles; we just weren't getting any updates for whatever reason. But now we do. We actually have more clarifications. The biggest clarification is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Yampil. We have the Russians raising their flags in the center and southern part of this town here. Very big news for the Russians. This would allow the Russians. This was the key to the southern part of Lyman. And they've cut this highway between Lyman and Seversk in this area here as well. We had another geolocate confirmation, Russian DRGs operating in this area of Lyman here. So we have Russians operating in Lyman. It's just right now they're probably just clearing the southern part here. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians continue pushing and take the village of Dnipropetrovsk and Ozarnia here. Take something like this, and then they'll have the Seversk Donetsk River as a defense, and then this would completely cover Seversk from the south, Lyman from the south, and then they can start entering and consolidating here. Now, also another big news is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Stavky. Stavky is on the higher elevation than Lyman. It kind of overlooks Lyman. Now, the Lyman defenses, there's a bunch of trenches in the front of Lyman because they expected a Russian offensive right against Lyman. So, it's going to be very hard for the Russians to attack from Stavky or just directly into Lyman. I don't think they'll do that. But taking Stavky does give the Russians a high ground overview of Lyman. So, taking Stavky, we have the Russians raising the flags on this town here. Plus we had the Russian push out of Zaporizhia, taking more of these fields. I wouldn't be surprised if the Russians take more of these fields between Stavky and Zaporizhia, and then they have this forward. They're right in front of Lyman. They'll have like a dominant overview of the city. So, we shall see how that. So that's a very good game for the Russians. Stavky, and then even more importantly, we had more confirmation the Russians have completely captured the village of Novoselivka. We actually never this town apparently was captured, according to Russian sources, almost 2 months ago, something like in September. But we didn't have any geolocation confirmation of that until now. We had the Russians raising flags here, so it does completely confirm that Novoselivka is under Russian control. And now, so that's a very big gain for the Russians. It's a big gain on the other side of the river here. It allows the Russians to push through here and have these positions across from pushing towards the Osko River here. But in any case, the biggest thing that's in the way of actually encircling Lyman and taking it is the town of Zaporizhia here. This town right here. And we had, as I mentioned, I think a week or two ago, we had GLK confirmation of Russian being in the northern part, but then the Ukrainians were attacking them. So we don't know if they got driven out. But in any case, this is where the Russians will have to attack to next. This will be where the Russians will have to break the Ukrainian defenses. So maybe what the Russians do in Novoselivka is they maybe take most of the village of Yarovava here, and then they attack Dorobezhyi from this area, and from Stavky, maybe from the east as well. Just try to put the pressure on Dorobezhyi because this is a very important town that the Russians have to take. And once they do take it, then as you can see, once they Dorobezhyi is basically the last thing they need to take, and then they can start storming Lyman. So in the meantime, probably for the rest of December, probably this year, the Russians will probably take, something like this, and then also something like this. And then from here, probably, as you can see at that point, then the Russians actually have Lyman in surrounded in 3 places, and then probably depending on how fast they do that, I think it will take them by the end of the year to secure this position here. But once they do this, then the Russians will break into Lyman from the north, from the south, and then just completely, try to overtake it and the Lyman will fall within a month or so. So, they're able to take this by the end of December. Probably by the end of January, Lyman will fall, and the Russians will be able to clear these fields, up to the Seversk Donetsk River here. So Lyman will fall, and then that will be a very bad situation for the Ukrainians. Lyman is a very strong logistics center. It's going to be the key to overtaking Slovyansk from the north. So it's a very big gain for the Russians. And the battle for Yampil, is already started, but they're just putting more screws on it. Alrighty, now we're going to go where everyone has been, this is kind of like the big 2020, when people think of like 2022, they think of Mariupol. When they talk about 2023, they think of the Zaporizhia offensive and of Avdiivka, and in 2024 it was Avdiivka, and then in 2023 was also Bakhmut too, and then like 2025 is all about Pokrovsk. So it's like these kind of big kind of if we talk about the war, this is where everyone kind of focuses on. Everyone's talking about Pokrovsk. And the Pokrovsk direction, there's also been, right now the big thing is that the Russians have taken Pokrovsk. We talk about this. They've encircled Myrnohrad. They're slowly squeezing the Myrnohrad pocket. And that's just continuing this time. But again, it's now that they've encircled it, it's just slowly grinding down the Ukrainian forces in Myrnohrad. Let's talk about it. So the first thing is that we had more and more confirmation of the Russians continuously pushing themselves out from the northern part of Pokrovsk. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these fields in the northern part of Pokrovsk. We had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this dachas right in the north here. And we also had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in these pig farms right here. So, even if these are more DRG operations, it does show that, this area between Radinsky and Pokrovsk, where they're actually have Russian troops physically present, and that means they basically have actually physically encircled Myrnohrad. And are holding, it's not only like, oh, it's just DRG activity, there being more and more consolidations here, so it's making it more and more of an official encirclement. We also, the Russians are, one of the biggest news though, besides that, is that the Russians have completely captured the southern part of Myrnohrad. Most mappers are actually saying this. Before the Russians were kind of in this kind of eastern part here, and we talked about how the Russians completely captured the villages of Listovka and Sukhol Yar last time, and it seems like the Ukrainians had a giant retreat back to the center of Myrnohrad. And so, the rest of the main defense of the southern part of Myrnohrad was this mine shaft, and this mine area was captured by the Russians. And so, it actually makes total sense that the rest of the southern part of Myrnohrad, which is those residential areas, would be captured by the Russians, even though we don't actually have geologic confirmation of the Russians being here yet. The biggest question on my mind is the situation of these high-rise buildings here. This map obviously shows that half of it has been taken by the Russians. And this is probably where the biggest clashes have occurred. I would assume the Ukrainians would want to hold on to this area, but again, maybe this is too deep. Maybe the Ukrainians wanted to retreat back to just, they don't want to be supplying this kind of this extended salient here. They want to maybe fall back to the center part of Myrnohrad, which also has high-rise buildings, as you can see right here, and this could be where they could hold up for a little while longer. Now, So, maybe they have retreated from this. We just need more. We had geolocate confirmation of the Russians being, I think, in the most southern part here. So it could be possible that they are clearing this. We just need more confirmation of this. But according to pro-Russian sources, is that everything behind this rail line has been captured, and also everything to the south, the southern part of Myrnohrad has been captured by the Russians. So very big gain. The Russians will then use this to continue pushing northwards here. But the Ukrainians do have some more like high-rise building areas into the center of Myrnohrad to prevent the Russians from attacking from the south. However, that it might not save them because the Russians have them completely surrounded, so they could advance from every direction. From the western direction, from Pokrovsk, the Russians, we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians entering Myrnohrad, pushing along this rail line, entering here. We still don't know the situation of Rivnia, but I think it's probably captured already. Maybe they just need to clear it up. Capture Rivnia is just a village on their way towards Myrnohrad. But yeah, so we shall, the Russians are now pushing through here. I wouldn't be surprised if Rivnia falls, and the battle for Seversk is already ongoing. We shall see if the Russians could consolidate their positions in these this industrial zone here, capturing more of this area right here. So, yeah, so the Russians are, improving it from the west. The Russians are also breaking into from the north. We talked about the Russians, clearing out these pig farms. This map shows that the battle for this northern citadel of Myrnohrad is underway. That before, I think last week we saw that only this northern part was taken, but now they're saying that this eastern part of the citadel has been taken. So we shall see. We don't have any geolocate confirmation of this yet. I think we only had it for the north, but we shall see. So if the Russians do take this northern part of Myrnohrad right here, and these. A bunch of these warehouses and this what is this place right here, like a mine shaft, like a warehouse and such. So they could take, right now the Russians are pushing towards here. So if the Russians could take that, they'll break the northern defenses of Myrnohrad. In the east, the Russians are breaking into this residential area, which makes sense. So, this residential area is, very weak. The Ukrainians can't hold on to it. My biggest thing, according to this mapper, and according to some other mappers, is that this eastern defense of Myrnohrad, this kind of giant citadel, which is being bombed to oblivion, by the way. I actually don't really believe that the Russians are here, because every day we're seeing the Russians bomb this kind of main citadel of the Ukrainians. The main defense of the Ukrainians is this citadel of Myrnohrad, along with this the center part, and then they could also defend in this kind of railway station here with a bunch of these industrial areas. But these are the main kind of defense nodes of the Ukrainians in Myrnohrad. So yeah, but in any case, the yeah, but this mapper shows that this part is actually about to be taken. If that's the case, then it's game set match from Myrnohrad. I mean, it already was. But they could have maybe held on for maybe a month or two. But if this citadel is falling, then it's game. It's almost over for them. So yeah, the Russians are slowly but surely they've captured the southern part. They're entering from the west. They're in the north. They're in the east. So just slowly but surely, Myrnohrad's being bombed to death and being slowly encircled and such. Now, also in this kind of Dnipropetrovsk area is that the Russians are, more and more insecure of their positions here. The biggest news has come from this area where the battle for Kharkov has finally ended. This is a very big gain for the Russians. This really improves their northern flank, their northern defenses here. As I said, taking Kharkov and holding it here will allow the Russians to kind of hold their positions right here. As I said, the Ukrainians had a tactical victory in taking out the Russians from Kuchov Yar, Zolto-Kolodatsky, and so forth. Protecting Dnipropetrovsk. But in terms of protecting the Ukrainians are attacking here, and their purpose is trying to unblock Myrnohrad, and the capture of Kharkov, basically, really harms Ukrainian efforts to dislodge the Russians here. We also had a geolocated confirmation that the Russians are in the village of Dorozhny here, and in Myrnohrad here. So it does show that this area right here has Russian presence. We still, and so forth. We also had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the northern part of Radinsky here, along with in the southern part. So it does show that Radinsky is under mostly Russian control, though it still has a Ukrainian presence. So the battle for Radinsky is still ongoing. So it's a very tough nut to crack here. But yeah, Kharkov falling is a very big loss for the Ukrainians here. And and a big gain for the Russians. So I wouldn't be surprised that once Myrnohrad falls, the Ukrainians stop attacking and the Russians reassert control over this area and fall back to Belitsky and such. And this will be kind of the northern flank here. And I think they'll probably stop at that point because they don't want to. They'll probably secure themselves here and then and such. maybe say Grishny, maybe, probably have the front line. Probably once what they want, once Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad falls, to have the front line be something like this. Something like that's going on. So, from there, as you can see, it's pretty much a flattened front line here. This will, then they'll be able to, accumulate forces in Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, and then there'll probably be a pause in operations here over the winter, maybe, and then they'll probably, and then later they'll start doing their offensive towards Dnipropetrovsk, which will be the main focus for the Group of Forces Center in the 2025 or 2026 campaign. One of the biggest news is also the Russians have captured the Pokrovsky mine. This has not been confirmed by Ukrainian sources, but we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being here. So we don't know if the Russians have captured this area, but if the Russians are operating in the southern part of this mine, then this probably northern part has been captured as well. But yeah, this shows that the Pokrovsky mine has been compromised. This was a very big defense area for the Ukrainians, and the Russians being here means it's very bad news for the Ukrainians. But a lot of Russian sources are saying this Pokrovsky mine has been captured, but we only have geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in the southern part of it. So, it's definitely, I could say, like, maybe the battle's still ongoing, but it's definitely about to be over. So this Pokrovsky mine will be a very big, solid defense structure for the Russians on the western flank of Pokrovsk here. And then also, I kind of combine Novoselivka here because it's the purpose of Novoselivka is to secure the western flank of Pokrovsk here. We talked about the Russians completely capture the southern part of Novoselivka that's on the other side of this Salonia River here last week through a fog campaign, and the main defenses of the Ukrainians were on this other side of this river. But this week we had geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this section. The Russians crossed this river and have captured this northern part of Novoselivka. So the only thing left really is this small residential area here. This will probably clear up very soon, and then this small little area here as well. These warehouses. So the battle for the Russians have penetrated. The Ukrainians, maybe they could have held on with the river to hold off any Russian advance, but that got kaput. So now that the Russians have crossed the river and have established a bridgehead here, it's basically over. I wouldn't be surprised if Novoselivka falls within a week or two. And then what will happen at that point is that the Russians will probably try to create a solid bridgehead between Novoselivka and Ivanovka. Probably try to clear these fields here, and then probably create a bridgehead on this between Novoselivka and Ivanovka, and that will be the new that will be what the Russians will focus on within the next week or two. So yeah, that's the Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad direction. Now we're going to go to the Kostyantynivka direction, and in the Kostyantynivka direction, there's also been a lot of big gains, and the biggest news is that the Russians have completely captured the village of Ivanopolia. We talked about the Russians were slowly but surely, breaking into this village. We had the Russians entering it from the north and the south and into the east. But this week we had the Russians raising their flags all over this town here. So Ivanopolia has been completely captured by the Russians, and this is very big news. As you can see, there's a string of villages going down from Ivanopolia towards Seversk, and then this would allow the Russians to then accumulate forces to move across these buildings and then enter Kostyantynivka. Because right now, before Ivanopolia was captured, the only way to enter Kostyantynivka, which the Russians were doing, was through these open fields, through all these villages that were blasted to pieces. So it was very much, very hard for the Russians to enter because of drones. However, with Ivanopolia, this will allow the Russians a staging ground to then, put troops into Kostyantynivka. So, we had, geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this area, and and as we mentioned the last month or so, we had Russian position, Russians being everything kind of behind this rail line and behind this highway has had Russian DRG activity. So we don't know how much consolidation is happening here, but we do know the Russians have entered this area, and now it's just a matter of, well, how much has the Russians consolidated here? This map says that just the most kind of southern eastern houses have been captured, but again, it could be more, and a lot of pro-Russian sources are saying that actually right now they have a huge chunk of this area under control, and right now they're trying to secure these kind of more solidified areas right here As you can see, these are more multi-story buildings, so they're trying to capture these areas, and then this would be a very big gain for the Russians. So the battle for Konstantinivka, as I mentioned, has begun, and if the Russians could secure themselves, secure fully and consolidate around this area of Konstantinivka, this will be a very big gain for the Russians, because then there's a big area for the Russians to accumulate forces, and then they can continue pushing into the center part of Konstantinivka on the other side of the Kerensky-Terezk River, and which is actually mostly just residential areas. There's actually not that much buildings in this northern part of Konstantinivka, so it's actually going to be pretty easy for the Russians to take the northern part of Konstantinivka. The big thing will be the southern part of Konstantinivka, which actually has high-rise buildings and an industrial zone, which actually has been blown up to pieces. If you kind of zoom in here, as you can see, it's been completely destroyed. Or not completely, but it's very much bombed to smithereens. Especially this part. I don't even know what the fuck this was. Looks like I got completely destroyed. Anyway, the Russians are entering Konstantinivka, and I think it's actually, instead of encircling it, I think they just want to directly attack it. Before, again, this war has been twisted upside down. You actually do want to battle in urban areas because it's actually easier to defend yourself from drones, and there's a lot more hiding places. So I think that's why the Russians just decided to attack Konstantinivka directly instead of trying to do a encirclement maneuver. And then also, a lot of mappers, I don't think we had geolocated confirmation of this, but maybe I just missed it, is that the Russians are clearing these fields that are to the north of Yablunovka here. This area right here, right to the south of the village of Stepanovka here. There's a bunch of trenches that are to the north of Alexandra Kilinova, Yablunovka, this section right here, but this map doesn't show they've been taken. But if the Russians have taken this area that I've circled, then that gives the Russian it's very good for the Russians. So just slowly but surely entering here. I think once the battle for now that they've captured Shakova here, maybe the Russians will try to do some sort of once they secure themselves in Pokrovsk and Myrnohrad, they could pull some forces to start maybe storming the village of Stepanovka, Dobobalka, Rozdishnya here. Maybe push themselves, try to take these villages here, and then start putting the pressure on Konstantinivka by putting more of an encirclement on it instead of just attacking it directly. Because right now, there's the Ukrainians could supply Konstantinivka pretty freely. Again, there's a lot of drones, so they get droned, but it's not it's not cut off, it's not encircled. So it's possible to send vehicles for supply here still. But so the more the Russians pressure the Ukrainians on the flanks here, it's gonna be hard and hard for the Ukrainians to supply Konstantinivka. So I think that's what will happen. But yeah, so the battle for Konstantinivka is still ongoing, and but the capture of Yampil is a very good gain for the Russians in this direction. Alrighty, now we're gonna go to the Kupyansk/Kharkov directions. A lot of interest. This is also, this is where a lot of people are focusing because of the battle for Kupyansk. Before we talk about Kupyansk, let's talk about a little bit more towards Borova, which is kind of the, between Lyman and Kupyansk. It's kind of like the lost brother because no one talks about it because nothing's happening there. But this week we actually had some news from this kind of Borova area near Kupyansk. Is that we actually had geolocate confirmation of the Russians taking the village of Borsovka and Andriivka. Now there's a long list of these, I think even if you scroll in, you can actually see these. Yeah, you can see it here. As you can see, there's a bunch of these trench networks here. And we actually had geolocate confirmation of the Russians clearing these two trenches here. And we also had a geolocate confirmation of the Russians entering these two streets of Buchaslavka here, this area right here. We don't know if those Russians if they managed to consolidate here, if they got kicked out. We need more evidence, but we did have, in the last week or so, the Russians taking Borsovka, Andriivka, and pushing through these fields there. So it does look like they're activating here. And a lot of Russians are saying the main goal is to reach the village of Novoselivka here. So yeah, if they manage to take Novoselivka and Buchaslavka, will be a very good gain for the Russians, because then they'll have enough positions to be right into the northern part of Borova, and but I think they're not gonna. I don't think they'll storm. Who knows? Maybe they'll storm Borova directly after that. But again, this kind of links up with what's happening in Lyman here, with the Russians pushing towards the Oska River in this direction. Because I think after Lyman falls, the main Russian goal will be then trying to move northwards here and put the squeeze on Borova from multiple angles and try to kick the Ukrainians out of this entire area that's on the other side of the Oska River and push them back on the other side. So. But right now, clearing out these villages to the north allows the Russians to attack Borova directly if they so wish. But again, the Borova can still be supplied through the southern part, so they might wait until the Russians maybe at least take Lazova and this area right here, and because then at this point they can't be supplied through these areas to the south here. The only place they could be supplied is through the Osko River in this area. But as you can see, the Osko River here is huge. You can't just put up a giant like a platoon bridge and then in very soon. It's gonna be very, very hard to supply Borovo. So I think once the northern part is cleared out and the Russians kind of clear out this area, as I mentioned before, Borovo will be stormed. But I think that happens after Lyman falls, though. Alrighty. Now, into Kupyansk itself, the biggest thing is that the Russian MOD says that they have completely captured Kupyansk. I don't think that's true yet. We don't have enough geolocated confirmation of the Russians being in this area right here. So we don't know if that's true yet. We do know the Russians were they showed themselves raising their flags all over the western part of Kupyansk. So we know the western part of Kupyansk has been captured by the Russians. It's pretty certain that like 85% likely that this north eastern part has been captured, but this south eastern part is still under Ukrainian control because we have no confirmation of the Russians raising their flags here. So I do think that is, I think the battle for Kupyansk is still ongoing. The Ukrainians are doing countless counterattacks. There could be still a lot of basements to clear, but it does show that the Russians are in Kupyansk and they're slowly but surely taking more and more of it. But I think it was premature for them to declare that they captured Kupyansk. They also claimed that they captured the village of Petropavlovka, but we didn't have any geolocated confirmation of that. So that's another thing that I think they pulled out of their ass. So I mean, it could happen, right? The Ukrainians could have retreated for Petropavlovka and retreated back to kind of more consolidated position around Kupyansk, Vasiloya to try to hold on to the bridgehead here. And Petropavlovka is a bit too much out of the way since the Russians are breaking through Kupyansk here. But we don't have any geolocation, so we'll still say Petropavlovka is under Ukrainian control. But I wouldn't be surprised that right now the Russians are trying to clear up Kupyansk, take everything here, and then the Ukrainians will have to then have a smaller bridge here focused around Kupyansk, Vasiloya here. So that's probably what's happening at the moment. But right now the battle for Kupyansk is still ongoing, but the Russians are taking more of it every day. And then a bit more to the north here, the Russians are continuously expanding their bridgehead here. The Russians have completely captured the village of Dnipropetrovsk here, this small village right here. So there's another village that was on the Kharkov Russian border that's been taken. So so as you can see, the Russians now have a very solid position, between Molova and this Dorishnya bridgehead here. Now the main Ukrainian defense lies around this like kind of string of villages along this river. It's kind of centered around the village of Kolodasny here, and so this is if the Russians want to like continue pushing forward, this is what we'll focus on to next. But the Ukrainians fell back to their next defense line after the border defenses fell. But I do think this is like very secondary access, so I don't think there's as much Russian troops put in this direction. So we shall see if the Ukrainians could hold on to here longer. If the Russians are able to break through and start, maybe taking Ambrondia and, take these line of villages, at that point, this will be, a bigger bad news for the Ukrainians here as they start reaching towards Veliki Baruk here. But yeah, so just another village along the border got taken. And then in the kind of Kharkov, Volchansk area here, the Russians are continuously expanding. They're about to finish the battle for Volchansk, about to take it fully. They already took all the major strong points there. It's just a matter of clearing them and just kind of consolidating. The biggest news is that the Russians have taken the village of Tuchishka here. This is like kind of extension of Selenikovko here, which has been taken last week. This is like just another. It's just a bunch of warehouses. Basically, it's not even a village. But yeah, this kind of small warehouse area has been taken by the Russians. We also had the Russians take this small warehouse area to the very southern part of Volchansk here, which makes sense. The Russians have cleared the southern citadel here, and now the main thing is the Russians are now trying to clear the southeastern part of Volchansk here. So the Russians are continuously pushing this forward. They have taken more and more of these like residential areas in Volchansk, and so now there's just like a few streets left, a few residential areas left. There's no stronghold really. The Russians just need to slowly take building by building and take everything here, and then they could claim they've taken the village of Volchansk, or the city of Volchansk. It's a pretty big city. So it's just a few more buildings they have to clear. They will probably take Volchansk by the end of the year. Probably also take Volchansk, Kulturoya here, and then at that point, I've mentioned this before, is that they'll take something like this, and then from here, they'll take the village of Vilchia, but then they'll kind of, I think they'll move down along this river, and taking a bunch of these villages and kind of use the river as a defense. They're like kind of more uh, their western defense as they move southwards. And because the thing is that the next kind of big town here is Bilikorodovsky here, and I don't the Russians aren't going to go from Volchansk to Bilikorodovsky because it's just a bunch of open fields, and the Russians will be bombed by drones repeatedly. So it'll be very hard for the Russians to move across these fields. So I do think it'll be much more safer for them to go along this river, which protects their flank, and there's forests, there's a bunch of villages here, and I think something like this, and there's not really any area the Ukrainians can use to kind of counterattack, because they'll fortify themselves along this area, and if they want to attack the Russians moving down here, they'll have to move across the open fields themselves and then get attacked by drones. So, yeah, I think that's what's going to happen here. But again, I think one of the biggest things here is that after the fall of Kupyansk, is that the Russians will probably try to liquidate this entire northeastern Kharkov direction, this area right here. It will be a very big gain for the Russians. But right now, they're just slowly but surely, about to end the battle for Kupyansk, about to end the battle for Rochansk, and at that point, they'll be able to then start doing their positions to start squeezing out the Ukrainians here. And there's been no changes in the Sumy direction. And so that's the, there's also that, I'll probably do a separate video analyzing the plan from Trump about the 26 points. I'll talk about why it's actually a very shitty deal for the Russians, all told, and why the talks about it being a Russian wish list are complete nonsense. So I'll do a separate video on that. But right now, this week basically just talked about what's happening on the front line. So if you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue to receive these weekly Russian-Ukrainian updates. Like this video, comment your thoughts, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. So aim high and wander on.